In the heart of a raging storm, where floodwaters swallowed the land and hope seemed lost, a wild Mustang fought for survival. His strength was fading, his body battered by the relentless current. But just as the odds seemed insurmountable, a man appeared, a rescuer with a troubled past and a heart that refused to let go. This is the story of Storm, the Mustang who defied death, and Daniel, the man who risked everything to save him. A tale of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond that forms when two souls fight for survival together. Stay with us, for what unfolds is a journey that will leave you breathless and inspired. The first raindrops began falling just before sunset, light at first, barely more than a drizzle. Within an hour, the skies unleashed an unrelenting torrent upon the valley. By midnight, the river had swollen beyond its banks, transforming the once dry plains into a raging sea of muddy water. In the middle of this chaos, a lone Mustang fought for his life. Storm had roamed free in this land for years, outrunning cowboys, escaping pens, and conquering droughts. He was wild, untouchable, a survivor. But he had never faced anything like this. The flood had caught him off guard while grazing near the river. The sudden force of the water had ripped him from solid ground, dragging him downstream before he could react. His hooves kicked desperately, but the current was too strong. Each time he tried to gain footing, the water pulled him deeper. Branches, tree trunks, and debris crashed past him, some hitting his body with brutal force. His powerful muscles burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he refused to give up. For hours, he fought against the cold, which seeped into his bones, slowing his movements. His head barely stayed above the churning surface as exhaustion dragged him down. Then, a massive tree trunk came barreling toward him. Storm barely saw it in time. He tried to move, but his body wasn't fast enough. The log slammed into his side, spinning him violently. His legs went numb, and his breath was ripped from his chest. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. He was going under. Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel of his truck, staring through the heavy rain pounding against the windshield. He had seen plenty of storms before, but none like this. The entire valley was underwater, rivers had swallowed roads, and ranches had turned into islands. Cattle and horses had been lost. The radio crackled beside him with warnings from a sheriff about flooded roads and the urgent need to reach high ground. Daniel had spent most of his life running into danger, as a soldier, then as a firefighter. He had saved lives, pulled people from burning buildings, and carried children from wreckage. But years ago, he had paid a price, and now all he wanted was silence. No more rescues, no more losing anyone. Yet, something moved in the water, a black shape struggling to stay above the surface. His pulse jumped. It was a horse, a black Mustang barely keeping its head above the water. The animal kicked against the current, but Daniel could see it was losing the fight. After a moment of internal struggle, Daniel threw his truck into gear and drove toward the chaos. Daniel's truck roared through the floodwaters, headlights flashing across the destruction. The river had swallowed the valley, turning familiar dirt roads into raging currents. Fence posts floated like twigs, and dead branches swirled in whirlpools. In the center of it all was Storm, the Mustang, his head bobbing, barely visible in the chaos. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped into the freezing floodwaters, the shock hitting him instantly. The current was too strong, pulling at him like claws. His boots slipped against the submerged ground as water reached his waist. Icy and unforgiving, he braced himself, gripping the truck door for balance. Storm's head went under again, and Daniel lunged forward. The Mustang surfaced with a desperate snort, his wide eyes full of panic. Daniel forced himself forward, despite the current's pull. "Come on, kid," he muttered, pushing through the water. Daniel's fingers brushed against wet fur, and then the Mustang thrashed, a final burst of survival instinct. Storm kicked out hard, his hooves slamming into Daniel's ribs. Pain exploded through his chest, but Daniel didn't let go. He adjusted his grip, securing his arm around the Mustang's neck. "Not today," Daniel growled. "You're not dying today." With the last of his strength, Daniel started pulling. His grip on Storm's waterlogged mane slipped as his arms screamed from the effort. The Mustang's weight was dead against him, too heavy, too exhausted. The current wasn't slowing, and each second dragged them farther away from solid ground. Daniel's vision blurred, his grip failing, his strength running out. Then, with a final desperate lunge, Daniel caught the lowest branch of a partially submerged oak tree. Pain shot through his shoulder as the weight of Storm and the force of the current threatened to rip him away. But he held on, grimacing, and hauled them closer to the tree. The Mustang collapsed against the base of the tree, his chest heaving. Daniel followed, slamming his back against the bark, gasping for air. For the first time in hours, they weren't drowning. The world spun around him, his fingers ached, and his entire body trembled from exhaustion. His ribs throbbed where Storm had kicked him, but they were alive. Daniel ran a shaking hand over the Mustang's slick, shivering body. "Hang in there, buddy," he said. The flood still raged around them, the storm unrelenting. The water was rising, but for now, they had survived. Daniel's entire body ached, his limbs numb, his muscles stiff from exhaustion. Every breath felt like fire in his chest, but he didn't have time to think about the pain. The flood was still rising, and they needed to reach dry land. Daniel assessed their situation. The only chance they had was a distant patch of land barely visible above the waterline, a small rise in the valley that hadn't been completely overtaken. It was at least a quarter-mile away, and Storm couldn't swim that far. Daniel spotted a long piece of barbed wire fencing tangled around a tree trunk. An idea formed. He would create a makeshift lead to pull the Mustang through the water. It was insane, but it was their only hope. He worked quickly, twisting the loose wires together to create a crude but strong lead. Storm was too weak to move on his own, but with the harness secured around his chest, Daniel could guide him through the floodwaters toward safety. "Okay, big guy," Daniel said, pressing a hand against the horse's damp coat. "Time to get up." Storm didn't move. Daniel exhaled sharply, bracing himself. With a deep breath, he grabbed the lead and pulled. The Mustang's muscles twitched, his legs shifting slightly. "Come on," Daniel urged, his voice raw from exhaustion. "I know you've got fight left." Storm's breathing quickened, his front legs trembled, then pushed. Daniel pulled harder, and with one last burst of strength, the Mustang shoved himself upright. They began moving forward, each step a battle against the current. The floodwaters surged around them, cold and relentless. Debris rushed past, broken fences, floating logs, even a drowned calf. Storm flinched at the wreckage, his body tensing under Daniel's grip. "It's just water," Daniel said, his voice strained. "Ignore it. Keep moving." The water grew deeper, rising past Daniel's waist. His boots struggled for traction on the uneven ground below. Storm stumbled, his legs nearly giving out. Daniel yanked on the lead, keeping him upright. "Don't stop," he barked. "Keep going." They were halfway there when Daniel saw it. A small, half-submerged patch of dry earth barely big enough for both of them to stand on. It was so close, but between them and safety, the current was at its strongest. A deep, powerful undertow ripped through the water, dragging debris into its swirling depths. Daniel turned to Storm. The Mustang's legs were shaking violently, his body drenched, his head low. But his eyes still held fire. Daniel clenched his jaw. "You've got one more push in you, don't you?" Storm let out a rough breath. Then disaster struck. A massive wave of floodwater surged toward them, carrying a floating tree trunk the size of a car. Daniel's pulse spiked. They wouldn't survive a hit. He reacted instantly, yanking Storm sideways just as the log slammed into the water beside them, sending a wave of freezing mud over their heads. Storm screamed, rearing up and breaking free from Daniel's grip. Daniel lunged, his fingers grasping at thin air. The Mustang vanished beneath the surface. Daniel's breath ripped from his chest. Without hesitation, he dove after him. The water swallowed him whole. Darkness, silence, cold. Daniel's body rolled violently, trapped in the river's grip. He forced his eyes open, searching. Then, a shadow, Storm sinking. Daniel kicked hard, reaching out. His fingers brushed wet fur. He grabbed hold, wrapping his arms around the horse's neck, fighting to pull them both up. The surface was too far. His lungs burned. His vision blurred. With a final desperate kick, they broke through. Daniel gasped for air, dragging Storm's head above water. The shore was just feet away. With one last pull, they hit solid ground. Daniel collapsed, dragging Storm with him. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Storm coughed. Daniel's entire body sagged in relief. The Mustang's eyes fluttered open, his chest rising in ragged breaths. Daniel let out a horse laugh. "You damn horse," he muttered. You better be worth this." Storm snorted weakly. They had made it, but now came the hardest choice of all. The floodwaters still raged behind them, but Daniel and Storm had survived. Daniel's entire body throbbed. His arms felt like lead. His ribs ached from Storm's earlier kick, and every breath came with a sharp pain in his chest. But he was alive, and so was Storm. The Mustang lay beside him, his black coat soaked and matted with mud, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. His ears flicked weakly. Daniel turned his head toward him. They had survived hell together, and now he had a choice to make. He had sworn he wouldn't care, wouldn't get involved. But as he lay there, listening to Storm's ragged breathing, watching the way the Mustang's dark eyes stayed locked onto his, something inside him shifted. This horse should have died, but he didn't, because Daniel didn't let him. With a deep breath, Daniel reached down, gripping the makeshift lead still wrapped around Storm's chest. "Come on, big guy," he said, his voice firm. "One more time." Storm's ears flicked. Daniel pulled gently. The Mustang grunted, his legs trembling, his muscles quivering against exhaustion. Daniel didn't let go. "You've got this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Storm pushed, his legs locking, and he stood. Daniel let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Storm swayed slightly but stayed on his feet. Daniel gave a tired nod. "Not bad," he said. Storm let out a weak snort. For a long moment, they just stood there, side by side, the only sound being the wind rustling through the flooded valley. Then Storm took one step closer, and Daniel felt it, the connection he had spent years running from. Pain, loss, responsibility. But this was different. This wasn't a burden, it was a second chance. He ran a hand through his wet hair, letting out a slow breath. "All right, Storm," he muttered. "Let's go home." The Mustang didn't resist. He just followed step by step. Sometimes, the ones we save end up saving us. Storm fought for his life, but in the end, maybe it wasn't just his life that was saved. As the floodwaters receded and the storm clouds parted, Daniel and Storm stood together on solid ground. Alive, but forever changed. Their journey was more than a fight for survival. It was a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and the unspoken bond between man and animal. Storm, the wild Mustang who refused to give up, and Daniel, the rescuer who found purpose in saving another life, remind us that even in the darkest moments, hope can prevail. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring tales of survival, resilience, and the extraordinary connections that unite us all. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we can find strength in each other. Together, let's celebrate the power of second chances and the bonds that save us.